single day, like I've always done and always will.
Passing these bills on the floor, making it another stand.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Chantel Destra. More than 50 years ago, a tenacious investigative reporter by the name of Geraldo Rivera shed light on an atrocity that was happening for decades in New York State. That was the Willowbrook State School on Staten Island. It opened in 1947 and was seen as the only option for parents struggling to care for children with developmental disabilities. They were told their children would have access to care and education, but their reality was just the opposite. Many of the children were left alone in dark, dirty rooms without enough food to eat. There were reports of children covered in urine and feces, and hepatitis was common. In 1972, Rivera produced a shocking expose about the conditions.
How is it living on the ward that you live? Disgrace. The attendants are trying their best, but the staff is just too small to do anything more than just try and keep the place clean. No rehabilitation, no training, nothing. And
after a class action lawsuit, Willowbrook closed in 1987. To mark more than 50 years since Rivera's expose, a documentary was released. It was produced by the state's Council on Developmental Disabilities and the Office of General Services. We sent a crew to capture the premiere in the Capital Region.
The idea for a documentary came to us about a year ago when we began producing a series of videos commemorating the 50th anniversary of Geraldo Rivera's expose. Our first interview in this series was with Geraldo and Bernard Carabello, and what they had to say was so compelling we thought, there is more of this story that we need to tell.
At the premiere of the documentary, survivors, supporters, and longtime advocates shared their respective stories on the Willowbrook State School while stressing the importance of continuing to remember the tragedy that was Willowbrook.
Thank you for pushing for change, for sounding the alarm, for your tremendous advocacy. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I know they feel the same.
Deborah Weisbach had a brother named Robert. Robert was affectionately known as Robbie to his loved ones. Robert was placed at Willowbrook State School at just 6 years old in 1958. Deborah spoke about the anger she felt about the conditions of Willowbrook.
And it was about 4 years after he died, I was in high school when the expose came out, which was extremely overwhelming and horrifying to me. I secretly watched the news. I secretly peeked at the newspaper. We never ever discussed it at home. And I was confused and angry and just couldn't comprehend why in the world my parents would have sent their son to this horrible place and have pretty much deserted him. And I spent years being angry. It's just important for me that my brother not be forgotten. And he meant something. He meant something to me. I know now that he mattered deeply.
Like Deborah, Jose Rivera also had a brother at the Willowbrook State School. Jose has continued to shed light on the pain, trauma, and regret his family has endured after putting his brother Louis in the state school with egregious conditions that they had no idea about.
As per the professionals at the time, Willowbrook was the only option. Unfortunately, what that did is caused significant trauma, emotional damage to my parents, and I think to the family. And I think my parents struggled with what they suddenly realized had happened when they took the lead of the professionals and recognized that Louis was not getting what they were led to believe Louis was going to get, and Louis regressed. So this documentary intent hopefully is to remind people of what can occur when we disregard human life, human beings, and what a human being is able to achieve when given the necessary supports, assistance, and an opportunity to thrive. People like my brother were isolated and hidden away from society when they were institutionalized, and there are families today who still bear that struggle, that suffering for having placed their child in a state institution and under misled by what they thought they were going to get for their child. So I hope that message comes out loud and clear from this documentary, and it's remembered for future generations to come.
While the groundbreaking Willowbrook expose was over 50 years ago, advocates say more still needs to be done to further advance the way in which people with developmental disabilities are cared for and looked after. One of those advocates is Willie Mae Goodman. After her daughter Margaret faced Willowbrook, Willie Mae became a fearless disability rights advocate and co-chair of the Willowbrook Committee. She underscored concerns many advocates had about Willowbrook and about how people with disabilities are cared for today.
The system is dealing more with paper than is with people. And you know they got a saying, putting people first. They are not putting people first. They putting paper first. And I have a problem with that. I'm hoping that with this, that people get to understand people like who has a disability, who can't speak. I'm hoping they will understand they have a right to live in a decent environment. They have a right to live in a community. And they have a right to participate in anything everybody else participate in.
The documentary titled The Path Forward, Remembering Willowbrook will be airing on PBS member stations across the state this month. Check your local listings. You can also watch it online or on YouTube. We'll link to it on our website. That's at nynow.org. And to learn more, we sat down with Vicky Hiffa, the acting executive director of the State Council on Developmental Disabilities, to talk about the documentary and the ongoing work to serve New Yorkers with developmental disabilities. Thank you so much for being here today, Vicky.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, you know, the governor recently signed legislation changing the name of the Developmental Disabilities Planning Council to the State Council on Developmental Disabilities, as you know, and she signed legislation sort of correcting the language used to describe people with developmental disabilities in housing, medical, and public authorities law. So can you describe the impact of the governor signing this legislation and the importance?
Sure. So for our agency, changing the name, while it seems minor, it really was important. Our agency, our state council, is part of a national network of councils. Per federal law, there's a state council in every state and territory across the country. Our state in New York State was the only one that still had the outdated name of Developmental Disabilities Planning Council. So this really, by changing our name, aligned us with all other state councils across the country. And the importance of the legislation to our agency is it got rid of some outdated language. We replaced it with more person-first language. But more importantly, it put in statute that our council must reflect the diversity of New York State, and also added some language around membership and making sure that we get more fresher voices on our council, so we have a more set rotation policy for the members on our council. So it'll be great to get more voices across the state really having an input on the policies and programs that we implement at our agency.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, the council was, you know, influential with the Office of General Services to putting together the documentary, sort of commemorating the 50th anniversary of Willowbrook and Geraldo Rivera's expose, you know, really revealing the egregious conditions at the state school, right? So why was it important for the council to put together that documentary? What was the thought process?
So, you know, the basic mission of our council and all the councils across the country is to improve the lives of people with disabilities so that they can live as independently as possible in the community they're choosing. And one of the ways that we fulfill our mission is to inform policymakers, stakeholders, and the general public about the benefits of community inclusion for people with disabilities. So last year, as you said, marked the 50th anniversary of Geraldo Rivera's groundbreaking expose. So we thought, what a perfect opportunity to inform the public about Willowbrook, because many people, particularly younger generations, have never heard of Willowbrook, and that needs to change. So we wanted to raise awareness about what happened at Willowbrook, and we also wanted people to be aware of how far we've come in the disability system over the last 50 years. So we wanted to celebrate that, but also make clear that we still have a ways to go before we really get full inclusion in the community for people with disabilities.
Right, absolutely. And I did watch the documentary myself. I must say I did absolutely enjoy it. So what was the preparation like in putting together the documentary? I know that, Willowbrook in itself is a unfortunate tragedy that has so many different layers and stories that really, impacted its closure. So what was that like putting together the documentary?
Well, it was an interesting process. Mm-hmm. We're a small state agency. We don't have a huge staff. Certainly no one in our agency had an experience making a documentary, so it was very new to us. Fortunately, I have a few staff that were really dedicated to this project and really worked hard, and we were also fortunate that our partners at Media Services, we had a person, Joe Walsh, who really was as passionate about the project as we were. So that really, really helped in developing the story. But, there were also things that we had to think about in trying to develop it. Was this happened over 50 years ago. Who are we going to interview? Who could we get now 50 years later? And I have to say, probably the biggest step for us was getting Geraldo Rivera to be interviewed. And I have Bernard Carabella to thank for that. I had contacted Bernard, and he, as you know, was a resident of Willowbrook. He lived there for 18 years and then was interviewed by Geraldo in his expose, and they are still friends to this day. And then we were fortunate to be able to interview other key people in the Willowbrook story. There was an event happening at the College of Staten Island, which, as you know, was where Willowbrook was formerly housed. So, it was definitely a process, and there were a few kind of barriers along the way, but we were really happy. And I think, the last thing I want to say, too, in terms of things that we had to kind of address, I think one of the biggest challenges we had is to keep this story, the documentary, under 30 minutes, because there are so many layers to this story, as you indicated, that we would love to have delved into, or stories. There were so many great stories and powerful stories that we weren't able to include. One of the aspects that we didn't address was the fact that residents there were purposely infected with hepatitis to test the vaccine. I don't think many people are aware of that, and we really wanted to include that, but just didn't have the time.
Absolutely, and as you mentioned, there's been so many ways in which people with developmental disabilities are, being treated for in a better way since Willowbrook, right? So I'm curious, from your purview, what ways can we continue to make advancements in the way that people with developmental disabilities are treated, either on the state level, but also on the federal level?
Yes, there are a lot of, we've come a long way in the 50 years, as you see in the documentary, but there's still a ways to go. People with disabilities still have a much higher unemployment rate than people without disabilities. They still face, various barriers to finding housing, affordable housing in the community, accessing transportation. So there are, many things that can be done at the state and federal level that still need to be done. We do have, civil rights and in law that people with disabilities must be not discriminated against, but, what's in law and what's in practice are two different things. So we have to really still work, and that's, as I said, something that the council does every day. To really, further and protect the rights of people with disabilities and make sure that we are, trying to break down those barriers and really drive systems change so that people can live fully included lives in the community.
Right, absolutely. And, there's been so much great work that's been done since Willowbrook, but how can we prevent, even smaller Willowbrooks from happening, or instances where there are just as egregious conditions happening? How can we prevent that in the years to come?
I think one of the things that we need to look out for are, protect the funding that's available for disability services. When Willowbrook was first opened in the 40s, it didn't start out as this awful institution. They really, it was really touted as a state-of-the-art facility for people with disabilities that you would want to send your son and daughter for the best care. It just, over time, became this awful place that, was, at one point, the largest institution in the world for people with disabilities. And it was really because of, just various cuts to funding over the years that, resulted in staffing ratios that were like 50, 60 people to one staff person, which is not manageable. So I think one of the ways is to really advocate and protect funding for disability services to make sure that, we have adequate staff. And I think, one of the things that we're, facing now is a crisis among direct support professional staffing. It was bad before the pandemic, but it's so much worse now. And I think that's something that really needs to be addressed, is to make sure that we have, sufficient staffing for people with disabilities. So we really need to address the pay and really, provide a career ladder for direct support professionals, so it's a career that they want to enter into, and we don't have so many vacancies that we do now in the field.
Yeah, and you shed light on a very important aspect, which is the aftermath of the pandemic, right? So in what ways, how can we support those individuals? Like, what can the governor do? What can the legislature do to ensure that people are not, being understaffed, or, facilities are not being understaffed?
Sure. So, I think, again, looking at, providing adequate funding, looking at, providing more innovative housing solutions. Not everyone with disabilities wants to live in a group home. Group homes are great. They're much better than living in an institution, but some people want to live, in just an apartment or a house. So providing more opportunities for that. So making sure that there's adequate funding. And I would also say that, again, looking at the direct support professional crisis and really providing sufficient funding and really addressing that in a long-term systematic way. That's something that, the governor and the legislature can do. And it's not just in the disability field, it's really in all human service agencies. So that this is a crisis with direct care staff. So, I think, looking at some longer-term solutions and not just putting a Band-Aid on it will really, I think, go a long way to making sure another Willowbrook doesn't happen again.
Absolutely. Well, you put it perfectly. There's been a lot of strides that's been made since Willowbrook, but there's still so much work to be done. So thank you so much for being with us today, Vicky. And that was Vicky Hiffa, Executive Director of the State Council on Developmental Disabilities.
Thank you very much for having me.
And as Vicky said, for people with disabilities, independence is key. A big part of independence for a lot of people comes from having a job. That's where NYSID comes in. They're a statewide network that connects people with disabilities with jobs, and they're looking for more support from the state. For more on that, I sat down with Maureen O'Brien, president of NYSID. Thank you so much for being here today, Maureen.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So NYSID, of course, was put in place after the closure of Willowbrook. And, following the closure of Willowbrook and the expose on the egregious conditions, I'm curious what the tragic legacy of Willowbrook has had on your organization, NYSID.
So I do think there's a positive legacy out of Willowbrook with our organization. It's different than many of the other legacies that exist. We came into existence post Willowbrook because Governor Hugh Carey at the time felt it was important to come up with ways in which individuals with disabilities could be integrated into communities and the workforce, and that's where NYSID came from. I do think we have to look at Willowbrook regularly. We have to review it every year. We can't forget what happened there, and we have to continue to learn from it as we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you touched on before, it's an ongoing fight, and there is still a lot of work to be done. So what role do you see your organization having in the years to come as you continue to fight for rights for people with disabilities?
Sure. We're going to continue to talk about employment for individuals with disabilities. Right now in New York State, the unemployment rate, if you are disabled, is 67%. Clearly, we aren't doing everything that we need to do to ensure that individuals with disabilities have access to jobs and have the appropriate settings in place so that they can be successful in the job. We do that a lot with social enterprises that we work with through NYSID and private corporations that have put the onus on making sure an individual with disability can succeed in the workplace. What I say all the time is individuals with disabilities are really, really great problem solvers. By the time they get to work, perhaps after taking public transportation, perhaps after getting dressed and back in a wheelchair, perhaps working through any number of issues, the easy part is once they're on the job.
Yeah, absolutely. And are there any specific industries that you're hoping would, employ more people with disabilities? And how can you help to encourage those employers to hire people with disabilities?
Yeah, so the program that we run, the Preferred Source Program for individuals with disabilities that NYSID manages, there are a number of different occupation areas and industries that we're allowed to work in where we can automatically contract with the state without having to go through the bid process. So we have a great number of customers at the government level who procure from us everything from janitorial services to digital accessibility to data imaging, all of those things. I think with AI and other things that are happening there, there's going to be in the technology space a whole bunch of other places where individuals with disabilities can be successful, and I look forward to working with the state on that.
Are there any sort of misconceptions about hiring people with developmental disabilities that you've had to sort of, work through in your role, and how have you kind of combated that?
Sure. One of the things I always say when it comes to hiring, particularly someone who's neurodiverse, what you and I would talk about as important in an interview process, sometimes someone who's neurodiverse can't do it. They can't sit across quietly from you and make eye contact. Perhaps shaking your hand would be something that they wouldn't embrace or welcome. And so if someone has the skills to do the job, that's what you have to interview for. You don't want to interview for eye contact, handshake, how the interview starts and ends. You really want to look at someone's skills and say, can they do the job? Will they be successful in the job? And can we give them the supports and structure where they will be? Some of the best employees I have in my organization are people who have had a barrier to employment because they come to work every day really excited about coming to work. They come to work really wanting to be on the job because they know what it's like not to have one.
Yeah. And, of course, your office is doing, or your organization is doing a lot of great work, and the work is ongoing, right? So I'm curious about your long-term goals in this fight for allowing people with developmental disabilities to really be in the workforce.
So there's two things we have coming forward at NYSID. One is the legislation that allows us to operate will sunset next year. So we'll have a boots on the ground effort to ensure that that legislation is renewed and that we can continue to operate the program that we're operating. In addition to that, we want everybody and anybody who wants to understand what we do to talk to us. We don't just have to sell our goods and services to government. Any private sector entity that is interested in diversifying their supply chain to assist individuals with disabilities can do business with us. This past year, we've done a number of things with Albany Medical Center and with their expanded footprint, and it's been great work for the individuals that we have.
Yeah. And what has, that preparation for next year's fight really entailed? Like, are there any specific advocates or lawmakers that you've been working close with as you gear up for, next year?
So right now in the Senate and the Assembly, there is a Disabilities Committee.
Right.
So again, that did not exist a number of years ago. The Disabilities Committee rolled up under the Mental Health Committee. Having our own committee structure in the Senate and the Assembly allows us greater access to elected officials to help them understand what it is that we do and why it's important. I feel like with the Chief Disability Officer, we also have a great venue to have a one-on-one conversation. What we need to do is get the word out. We need to get to work. We need to hit the ground running as soon as the legislative session starts.
It sounds like your office has been doing really important work, and I really hope that, you get the extension that you so deserve. It sounds like you're already prepared for next year's fight. So please keep us posted on how the extension goes, and hopefully we can have you back here on the show very soon. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. And that was Maureen O'Brien, President and CEO of the New York State Industries for the Disabled. And we'll link to NYSID's website on our website. Again, that's at nynow.org. As we close out this week, we return to Willowbrook. Today, it's known by another name. The College of Staten Island sits on part of the site that was once Willowbrook and is home to the Willowbrook Mile, a memorial to remind people of what happened there and how far we've come. That does it for this special episode of New York Now. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next week.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET and by the New York State Education Department.